I introduced myself as a backcountry guide from Whitehorse the moment I started telling this, because my job was the only reason we were deep enough in the interior to stumble on that cabin with the table already set. I had spent years walking clients through the Yukon's shut-in valleys and glacial passes, reading weather like scripture and counting the ways spruce bark can save a night. Late summer meant long light and thick mosquitoes, and the trail north of the Pelly Mountains was as familiar to me as coffee in the pre-dawn. We weren't supposed to find anything out there but rusted traps and last year's caribou tracks. We were 3. My sister June took photos and kept us honest about our pace. A geology grad named Elijah came for rock outcrops and silence, the kind you only hear when even the birds hold their breath. I came for money and the comfort of doing what I knew. The plan was a 4-day loop. Unremarkable. Safe. My father had one rule he said belonged to the old-timers, the ones who stayed after the prospectors left and the maps got printed neat. He'd told it to us around our cabin stove every winter until we could recite it. In the Yukon interior, if you find a set table, you do not eat, you do not touch, and you do not stay past dusk. It sounded theatrical when I was a kid, like campfire theater with a punchline he refused to give. We started along the braided creek where the alders pinched the water into thin silver threads. The sky did what the northern sky does in August, going soft at the edges until noon, then bursting clear as a knife. Black spruce leaned and clicked in the wind like a row of stiff old men. The ground was sponge and drinking straw at once, muskeg that swallowed booth eels and spat out the stink of old leaves. I walked point, listening for bear grunts and watching for the white scalp of a dead tree the map said would mark the turn. June kept shooting, kneeling to frame lichens like continents. Elijah said almost nothing. He had a way of moving that made the forest forgive him as he passed, like a fox. We fell into the rhythm. Step, check, step, call back, step. By late afternoon of day 2, clouds stacked pale and feathered over the high ridge, promising rain that might arrive or might not, the sky being a liar in these latitudes. We decided to make camp in a notch of spruce near a shallow pond, as still as a poured mirror and not much cleaner. The mosquitoes threw a party and the wind didn't get invited. I lit the stove with hands that had done it 100 times. Flame, water, ramen, the holy trinity of tired hikers. We ate in that quiet you only get when you've burned the day down. June passed her camera and showed us a series of shots. Wolf tracks, moose scat, a line of blueberries on a sun-bleached log. In one frame, I recognized our own boot prints curving along the creek like a sentence we hadn't finished yet. Elijah pointed out a band of quartz in the far bluff, smiling like a man who'd been offered secret. I almost mentioned the rule then, because of how empty it felt and how the wind began to crawl, but I didn't want stories in June's head before she slept. I checked our bear hang, listened for the chainsaw cough of a grouse, and crawled into my tent. The sky held a sour light past midnight. My dreams were thin and full of running water. Morning came colder than it should have. A stitch of autumn pulled through summer's sleeve. We packed with stiff fingers and set off under a sky the color of tin. The creek thinned to a thread, and the muskeg gave way to upland, where the tundra grew clean and close to the bone. We moved faster there. Wind pushed our backs with invisible hands. It appeared when we topped a low moraine and saw the valley laid out like a folded palm. There was no smoke, no trail, no road, just a smudge of dark against the green and a line of roof flashing the sun back at us like a distant wink. I stopped and lifted my binoculars. A cabin sat where no cabin should have been. I've seen trapper shacks, their roofs cave in like old mouths. I've seen mining shanties, all iron and shame, rusting by a creek nobody visits. This was neither. The roof was new metal. The logs were peeled and clean. A small porch held a chair angled, as if someone had risen from it a moment ago to fetch something and would be right back. No smoke, no sound, no paths stamped into the moss. I thought you said this route was empty, June said. It is, I said, and felt the way you do when a familiar room has an extra door you never noticed. Maybe an outfitter's place, Elijah said. Seasonal. Outfitters don't build in hollows that flood. And they don't forget to put up caches or cut brush around their walls to keep the fire creep down. But I said, maybe because I prefer people to quiet if I have to choose between worrying someone will be angry and worrying something will be wrong. We descended. The wind died the moment we dropped below the lip of the moraine, so the valley gathered our sounds and held them close. Boots on moss. A strap creak. The small clack of June's camera bumping her sternum. The cabin grew larger, less hypothetical. The wood was spruce cut green and still shining where the draw knife had kissed it. The window glass held the sky in hard squares. The door stood open. I called out the way I always do when I approach a structure in the backcountry. My name, who we were, the direction we came from, the fact that we were unarmed beyond bear spray and a knife. It's a courtesy where I'm from. People need warning so they don't meet you with a barrel. Nothing answered but the thick quiet of moss and wood. We stepped onto the porch. The boards didn't creak. Inside, the air smelled like with soap and cinnamon and something else that made the hairs on my arms rise. I knew that smell before my eyes confirmed it. Fresh bread. A loaf sat on a cutting. Bored the way my grandmother used to leave hers when she needed it to cool before slicing, with a clean knife beside it and a rind of butter sweating on a plate. I could still see a glisten where heat had touched the crust. June took a photo and then lowered the camera as if she'd done something rude. "There's no dust," she said. Elijah ran a finger along the back of a chair and looked at the clean pad of his fingertip. "Someone's here," he said, which I didn't correct because that would have meant saying the opposite, that someone wasn't here, but had been so recently the air still remembered. The table was set for 3. White plates, stainless forks, cloth napkins folded in a way that said someone cared about presentation even at the end of the world. The bread, a bowl of late raspberries that still wore their dew like jewelry. 3 glasses, each half full of water with tiny bubbles clinging to the sides. My mouth watered because that's what mouths do when they see bread, but my stomach flinched like a horse sensing a snake. I stepped back without deciding to. I was a child again with my father's voice in my ear. In the Yukon interior, if you find a set table, you do not eat, you do not touch, and you do not stay past dusk. The words rose like a chill out of my spine and put a weight on my tongue. I should have said them. I should have turned us around right then. But June was looking at a shelf lined with jars, and Elijah had opened the tiny stove to see if there were coals, and suddenly I didn't want to be the myth guy who ruins a surprising story with superstition. "Maybe they're out tending something," June said. "Traps? A garden?" I stepped to the one small window and looked out at the bruise-colored grass. No cut marks, no trail, no patch of turned soil or line of stakes for drying anything. The valley might as well have grown the cabin like a fungus. We were the only disorder in the order. "I don't like squatting somebody's place," I said, keeping my voice even. "We leave a note, move on, and if we need shelter we come back before we lose light." That sounded like a compromise. Responsible. Adult. June had her phone out as if instinct had overridden logic. No bars. She knew there wouldn't be, but human rituals are sticky. She pocketed it and wandered toward a small door at the back that I assumed led to a sleeping nook. Elijah checked the stovepipe for residue, shook his head at how clean it was, and then stood regarding the bread like an archaeologist trying to decide whether brushing dust from a bone would end the world. "Smell it," he said to me. "I don't want to," I said. He laughed, quiet and friendly, but there was nervousness in the way it broke at the end. "You superstitious?" he asked. "Just cautious," I said, and caught a flicker in the glass of the window like someone had passed outside, a shadow slanting across the sky's reflection. I turned fast enough to make my knee ache. No one stood there. The grass didn't hold anything but the frames of our boots. The sleeping nook held a single bed, neatly made with a heavy wool blanket tucked hospital tight. A book sat on the small table by the pillow. Not a Bible, not a manual. A paperback so worn the cover had peeled up at the edges, the spine broken into white ladders. June lifted it and read the first line aloud without thinking. "We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert when the drugs began to take hold." "Hunter S. Thompson," Elijah said. "Huh." She shut it and put it back down exactly where it had been, suddenly careful. Her hands trembled, and she rubbed them together like she was too cold for August. "This is weird," she whispered. "This is really weird." The back door, if you could call it that, was a plank on leather hinges that opened into the small shade where water might stand if it rained. There were no footprints there, just the clean tongue of earth. A bucket sat upside down next to a neatly coiled length of rope. A pair of boots, men's size maybe 10, rested beneath the short bench like they were sleeping dogs. "Hello." I called again and used the name of the nearest outfitter I knew, which was a bluff but a kind one. "We're passing through. Your place is tight. We'll leave it as we found it." I paused, waiting for the scrape of a chair in the brush, the cough of someone clearing their throat. The silence resumed its slow, deep breathing. We should have gone then. We should have stepped backward and let the door fall, and carried ourselves away from that bright, clean square of wrong. But when I told them we were moving on, the sky answered for me with a single cold drop on the back of my neck, then another, then a curtain of rain that came down so suddenly it might as well have been poured from the lip of the clouds. The light went gray as unpolished steel. "Inside," I said, because I am practical when it matters. Rain like that can chill you quick, and a wet hiker is a stupid hiker. We ducked back, and the door swung shut behind Elijah with a solid, friendly sound. The cabin held heat weirdly, as if it preferred a specific kind of warmth that our bodies didn't provide. My skin prickled. June took off her shell and hung it on a peg. The drips hit the floor with pennyweight taps. Elijah set his hat on a corner and went back to the bread like a moth pulled by light. "Don't," I said, sharper than I wanted. "We didn't bring it. We don't take it. You said we'd leave a note." June reminded me, half a smile that didn't make it to her eyes. "We could also leave money." I shook my head. A piece of me I didn't often listen to sat up straight and set its jaw. The smell of cinnamon became louder, like a voice you notice not because it shouts, but because everything else has fallen silent to hear it. The bubbles in the water glasses clung and then let go in trembles like something had brushed the table with a fingertip. I wrote the note anyway. Name, date, route, shelter from sudden storm. Thank you for the roof. I didn't mention the bread. I didn't mention how clean the stove was or the line of boots that had never met mud. I didn't mention the way the rain sounded wrong on the roof. Not a patter, but a close, continuous hiss, like a snake too long to see. We stood there and listened to ourselves try to be normal. June asked Elijah about his thesis. He gave an answer that used words like metamorphic grade and tectonic uplift, and every few seconds he glanced at the bread the way men look at an open door in a bad neighborhood. I said we'd wait an hour and then go. That felt like a promise made to something that wanted us to forget time entirely. When the first strange thing happened, I nearly convinced myself it wasn't strange at all. June wiped a circle on the window glass with the sleeve of her fleece to see how bad the rain was, and the fogged oval cleared. I watched it refog because we were 3 damp bodies in a sealed room, and then I watched another circle form, smaller and higher, as if a child had put their mouth close and breathed. The skin on my arms lifted again. I reached the window in 2 steps and laid my palm to the glass. The second circle didn't match my hand. It didn't match any of our heights, either. It sat higher than I could comfortably reach. Condensation, Elijah said immediately, because professionals like to join hands with any explanation that will have them. Temperature differential. Draft. From where? June asked. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. The cabin was tight as a jar. I made a new plan right then because I didn't like my old one anymore. We'd hunker for 10 minutes to see if the rain would ease its tantrum. Then we would shoulder our packs and walk into it anyway. Wet is better than wrong. I stepped to the door and reached for the latch. It didn't lift. I tried again. It wasn't locked because there was no lock, just a carved wooden wedge that slipped down to keep the door from drifting. I lifted and jiggled and felt the stubbornness of well-fitted wood. The door had swollen, I told myself, the way wood does when the air drinks too much and gets heavy. I braced my foot and heaved. The latch popped up with a sigh, and the door opened onto rain so thick and straight it made the world look like a slate curtain. The grass in front of the porch held 3 sets of boot prints that hadn't been there 6 minutes earlier. Ours should have remained, but these were new and crisp and wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. They approached the porch and stopped at the first step. The top of each print had a small notch, almost like a chevron cut. None of our boots had that. None of the boots under the bench had that. I had the sense that the notch meant something specific, the way a track guide tells you that a splay means running, that a drag means wounded. I didn't want to think what the notch meant. "Elijah," I said without turning. "Look." He stepped up beside me and exhaled like someone had pressed his chest. "Huh." June stayed 2 paces back, her camera down at her side, knuckles white on the strap. "Those are ours," she said, as if arguing with a dream. "We just came up the steps." "Not those," I said. Rain erased edges fast. The neat walls of each print began to soften, not blur the way water usually does, but relax, as if the moss was happy to become a footprint and didn't want to be coaxed too much. I closed the door because the sound of the rain made a roof of noise over my head and left too much room beneath it for thoughts I didn't like. June found a tea kettle on a shelf and reached for it like a reflex. She filled it at the bucket in the corner that had no water source near it and set it on the stove as if she'd lived here all her life. Elijah sat at the table and didn't touch the bread, but didn't look away from it either. I went back to the window and watched the footprints fade. "It's just a place," I told myself. "It's just a place where someone left bread." The words weren't convincing, even to me. The kettle sang. It sang fast. It had no right to be ready that quickly on a cold stove. June, startled, turned down a flame that didn't exist and poured steam into 3 cups that hadn't been on the shelf a moment earlier. The cups matched the plates. White, clean, waiting. "We should go," I said, and my voice touched something in the room that made it lean closer. "We can't," June said, looking at the door like it might offer an argument. "Look at that." She pointed to the window. The rain didn't fall in sheets anymore. It fell in lines, each one thin and straight and spaced like bars on a page of music. Behind them, the valley looked a fraction of a shade darker than it had before, as if someone had held a sunglasses lens between us and the world and then taken it away. The air tasted metal. Elijah finally tore his eyes from the bread and regarded me, perhaps to see whether I was frightened. He didn't find what he hoped. He found that I was frightened and trying not to be, which is worse. "It's a shelter," he said, presenting the facts like cards. "Wood, roof, stove, table, chairs. We wait until evening and then—" "No," I said too fast. The word came like a stone thrown and landed with equal weight. "Not past dusk." I didn't say the rule. I couldn't put it into the air because I had the feeling that speaking it out loud would be like turning a key in a door I couldn't see. But I heard my father anyway, patient and insistent, while rain mapped its lines on the glass. The tea tasted like nothing like hot rain. June wrapped her fingers around the cup and did not drink. We kept our packs on. We didn't say why. We stood like visitors who know a visit has gone on too long and can't find the parting words to end it. The cabin watched us with every surface. The bread cooled. The water bubbles rose and broke and rose again, a small, persistent rehearsal of vanishing. When the second strange thing happened, it came in a shape that let me argue with it for a handful of seconds before I lost the argument. June's camera clicked once, low and close. She hadn't lifted it. Her hands were around the tea. The strap hung quiet against her jacket. The click had come from behind the sleeping nook door. We all heard it. We all paused the way prey does, making stillness into a shelter. "Some wind somewhere," Elijah said, softer now, as if explanations were shrinking to fit the space left for them. "Something's settling." I took 2 steps and pulled the small door open. The bed was still made. The blanket was still neat. The paperback still lay on the table with its cracked spine like a stitched wound. But the book wasn't Hunter S. Thompson anymore. It was different. The cover a photograph of the 3 of us standing on the porch in rain, our faces grainy and dark, as if shot through a window. The title was not a title. It was a sentence printed in clean, indifferent font. We were hiking in the Yukon. We found a cabin with fresh food on the table. My throat went dry, so fast it hurt. "Okay," I said, not to anyone. Just the word. "Okay." A raft you throw into water because it's what you have. I didn't touch the book. I didn't call them over to see it. I closed the door quietly and walked back to the table because I didn't yet know how to do anything else. June looked up at me and saw something in my face that made her swallow her question. "What?" she asked anyway, because courage doesn't always come wrapped in strength. Sometimes it's just a thin voice walking into a larger silence. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." June didn't argue. She just pushed her chair back so slowly that the legs made no sound against the floorboards, like she was trying not to wake something. Elijah hesitated, eyes flicking from the bread to me, and then he stood too. I could see his hands shake as he adjusted the strap on his pack. I opened the door. The rain was still falling in those strange, straight lines, but the prints at the bottom of the steps were gone. The moss smoothed over as if the valley had healed them away. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. We stepped out onto the porch. The air felt thicker, heavier, like we were moving through a room where someone had been smoking for hours. No wind, no bird calls, just the sound of the rain hitting the earth in perfect rhythm. Halfway down the steps, I glanced back. The cabin door was still open behind us, and for a second I thought I saw movement inside, like the bread knife had shifted, gleaming at a different angle. June saw it too. Her breath caught, and she reached for my arm. I didn't let us stop. We followed the slope up toward the moraine, our boots sinking into the wet moss. The climb should have been easy, but it felt like walking uphill in a dream, where your legs weigh twice as much and the ground tilts wrong beneath you. When we reached the top, I turned to take one last look at the valley. The cabin was gone. There was just grass, slick and green under the rain, and a flat stretch where the building had stood. No wood, no porch, no sign that anything had ever been there. June whispered something, too quiet for me to catch, and Elijah just stood there, staring down like he was trying to force the cabin back into existence by will alone. I didn't say a word. I just turned us toward the trail home. My father's voice was louder than the rain now, threading between each breath I took. In the Yukon interior, if you find a set table, you do not eat, you do not touch, and you do not stay past dusk. We didn't speak the rest of the way out. It's been 3 weeks since that hike. June hasn't developed her photos yet. Elijah won't return my calls. And yesterday morning, when I stepped out onto my own porch, there was a loaf of bread sitting on the table, still warm, with 3 plates set beside it. We didn't talk about the bread for 2 days. June flew back to Vancouver for work. Elijah messaged once to say he'd made it home, then nothing else. I told myself it was just the way people drift after a trip, that the silence didn't mean anything. But it felt like the hike had left a low hum in my head, something I couldn't turn off. I spent my mornings splitting wood outside my cabin and listening for sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps in moss, the quiet clink of silverware. By the 3rd night, I'd started locking my door, which I hadn't done in years. That's when the first thing happened. I woke around 2 a.m. to the smell of cinnamon. It was faint at first, just enough to make me think of the cabin, but it grew stronger until it was impossible to ignore. I checked the stove cold. The counters clear, but the smell seemed to be coming from inside the walls, drifting through the knots in the pine like it belonged here. I stood there barefoot, holding my breath, waiting for it to fade. It didn't. By morning, the smell was gone. The next night, it came back, and this time, I heard something with it, a soft, dull thunk like the weight of a loaf of bread hitting wood. Twice. 3 times. The next strange thing was the camera. June called me a week later, her voice tight, like she was trying to keep something from spilling out. She'd finally tried to load her Yukon photos onto her computer, but the folder was empty. Not corrupted, just gone. Every other trip, every other hike, still there. Only that set had vanished. I didn't delete them, she kept saying. I swear I didn't. It's like the card was never in the camera. I didn't tell her about the smell. I didn't tell her that I'd been keeping my boots by the bed, so I could be out the door in seconds if I had to. The 3rd thing happened to Elijah. He left me a single voicemail. It was just breathing at first, fast and uneven, then his voice low, almost a whisper. There was a knock at my door, he said. When I opened it, there was a table. Outside, in the hallway. Then the line went dead. By the 4th incident, I'd started feeling like the air itself was watching me. I was chopping wood in the yard when I noticed prints in the snow. Not fresh, but clear enough to see the notched tops I remembered from the cabin steps. They started near the tree line, came halfway to my porch, then stopped. No turn, no backtrack. Just stopped. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum in my head had turned into something sharper, like a thin wire pulled tight. I found myself pacing the kitchen, staring at the table. And then, God help me, I heard the scrape of a chair moving, slow and deliberate, though I hadn't touched it. I froze. That's when the local rule came back into my head, uninvited and unshakable, my father's voice steady as ever. In the Yukon interior, if you find a set table, you do not eat, you do not touch, and you do not stay past dusk. I think I knew then that whatever had been in that cabin hadn't stayed behind. I didn't sleep the next night either. I moved from window to window, like a watchman who didn't trust his own rounds. Every time I tried to sit, the chair legs made that same slow scrape I'd heard before, like the cabin wanted to rearrange itself by inches when I wasn't looking. The fifth thing didn't pretend to be subtle. It arrived the way weather does, complete, undeniable, and with its own laws. Just before dusk, there was a soft knock on my back door. Not the front, the back. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. I stood in the kitchen and watched the doorknob, expecting it to jiggle or turn. It didn't. The air went still enough to feel like it was listening with me. I opened the door. My porch table held a loaf of bread on a cutting board, a dish of raspberries beaded with water, and 3 glasses half full. No plates this time. The change felt intentional, as if someone had miscounted us on purpose. Steam drifted off the crust the way mist lifts off a river at first light. I didn't step out. I didn't touch anything. I shut the door slowly, then locked it and slid the bolt across, a habit my hands found without asking my permission. When I turned around, the indoor kitchen table had moved closer to the window. Just an inch. But it had moved. My phone vibrated. June. I answered so fast I almost dropped it. I dreamed about the valley, she said, voice too steady. She was holding herself together word by word. Except it wasn't a valley. It was my apartment. Everything was parallel, like 2 rooms laid on top of each other. I told her about the bread on my porch without the parts that would make her feel helpless. I left out how warm it had looked. I left out the raspberries. I don't think it stays put, she said. I think it follows the habit of a place. Table, chairs, windows. It uses whatever matches. That's not a thing, I said, and hated how my mouth made the words softer than I meant. I know, she said, and I knew she did. It still feels true. We made a plan without saying it was a plan. She'd fly up and stay with me a few days. Being together felt like an act of defense. Elijah didn't pick up when I called him. His voicemail message sounded distant, as if he'd recorded it standing outside on a winter street. Night laid itself over the trees. I shut off the lights and sat where I could see the kitchen and both doors. My eyes adjusted until the room settled into black and silver shapes, edges were light. From the yard lamp snagged on the backs of chairs. Outside, the loaf sat like a lit ember in my imagination until I could smell cinnamon again, even though the windows were closed. I must have drifted, because when the sound came, it folded directly into a dream. A single delicate clink of glass against wood. Then a second. Then the smallest rustle, like fabric being unfolded with care. When I opened my eyes, the room had shifted by a degree I couldn't name, the way a person changes when someone they love walks into the door behind you. I stood up slow. Every movement felt taxable, like the house might ask for more if I spent too much at once. Another sound closer this time. A drip. Then another. It took me a breath to locate it. The glasses on the indoor table weren't empty anymore. Condensation traced thin lines down their sides and gathered at their bases, bright on the dark wood. I hadn't seen them fill. They had simply become full. I held my breath. The glasses trembled. The bubbles clung and let go. Something outside stepped onto the back porch. The plank I knew to be a fraction lower than the others took weight and answered like a tune board on a stage. Not heavy, not light, the exact weight of attention. The porch table creaked. Knife on wood. I felt it as much as heard it. A slow, deliberate draw across a crust. The knife never lifted. The sound moved through bread in a single patient line. I went for the front door because I didn't want to be there when the back door decided we were done pretending locks mattered. My boots were by the mat. My pack was leaned against the wall. I slung it without looking, felt the familiar drag of its weight like an anchor I didn't entirely hate, and opened the door into the kind of night that looks thin and turns out to be deep. Halfway down the steps, I stopped myself from looking back. The urge to confirm whether the loaf had slices in it felt like a lure made of my own curiosity. I kept going. Gravel under my boots made a sound that covered other sounds for a moment, the way laughter sometimes covers grief. I made for the trail that runs along the spruce line toward the river. I wasn't thinking beyond distance and the kind of movement that proves you're still possible. The forest gave me the smells I knew: wet resin, old leaves, the cold iron of water somewhere close. My breath found a rhythm, and the tight wire in my head loosened a fraction. The night wasn't empty. Someone else moved with me, far enough away that I could tell myself it was wind. The pacing matched mine, a bad harmony. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped, it made a choice and took one more step. Just one, like a partner who refuses to make you turn first. I kept walking. 100 yards in, the trail turned along the ridge and gave me a slice of moonlight. The path ahead was a pale smear through darker ground. I saw them there. Boot prints. Not mine. Notched at the top like the ones at the cabin steps. Laid down fresh where no one had walked since last rain. They ran along the center of the trail and then stopped where the ridge narrowed. Toes pointed toward the drop, as if whoever had made them had simply kept walking out onto the air. I stepped off the trail and moved through the scrub instead, branches flicking in my jacket with a lightness that felt like hands arguing about whether to help or hold. The sound behind me shifted from the trail to the scrub without any of the clumsiness a person would have made. It didn't break a twig. It didn't breathe. The river found me with its talking. Midsummer water, full and fast from distant melt, shouldered the bank with its own confident weight. I went down the slope fast enough that the ground moved under me, caught myself on a willow, and slid the last few feet. Water threw its cold up at my face. I don't know why I believed what I believed in that moment. Maybe it was a superstition I'd carried without testing. Maybe it was a memory of my grandmother saying some things don't cross running water because it's moving and they aren't. Maybe I just needed the river to be more than wet. I stepped into the current. It hit like a brace and pulled as if it wanted me instead of my idea. I set my poles and felt the bottom under my boots, felt the push, felt how quick cold can become hurt. The far bank looked like a promise I couldn't read. I made the mistake of glancing back. Something stood at the top of the slope, just above the place I'd slid. Not in the open, behind the lean of spruce where the lower branches made a tint of shadow. It didn't lean out to look at me. It didn't need to. I knew it saw me. I knew because the black between the needles felt occupied in the way of a room that has a single person in it, silent and paying attention, making the air hold its breath. I didn't look again. Looking is a permission. I kept my eyes on the far bank and moved. The river asked for each step with both hands. My thighs went numb. My fingers stopped being mine and became pale tools at the end of my arms. I made it to a rock that lifted me into shallower water, and then to another, and then the far shore was under me, and my knees almost gave with the shock of not fighting. I turned only after the river was at my back, and a line of alders was between me and the slope. The spruce stood where it had stood. The shadow had become a shadow. But on my side of the bank, where no one should have stepped, 3 prints marked the mud. They started at the water's edge. Not running, not splashed. Fresh, as if pressed by a patient hand. The top of each print had that same neat notch. I walked. I did not run because running pulls attention the way light pulls moths. I walked until my muscles forgot they had been water cold and became land cold instead. I walked until the trees thinned and the houses at the edge of town began, scattered and lit like small ships at sea. My neighbor Earl keeps a light on his porch that has always been more for mood than defense. It painted his chairs in honey and his railing in gold. It also lit the shape waiting on my porch table. Only one this time. A single plate. Empty. The emptiness rode the light the way a coin rides a fountain. I didn't go up. I cut across the yard and went to Earl's door and knocked. He opened it with the mild surprise of a man who expected no visitors and made room for me with a step. Earl lives alone. His television murmured hockey highlights that had ended hours ago. He He looked at me with his eyebrows rather than his mouth. "Stay a few minutes," I said, and he did, because that's the kind of place this is. He poured a whiskey with hands that didn't ask why they were pouring, and we sat watching men skate across ice in loops that belonged to yesterday. When I felt like I was anchored again, I walked home. The plate was gone. In its place sat a folded note in neat block letters I didn't recognize. I didn't pick it up. I read it there in the porch light, heart loud enough to throw a shadow. "You set the table when you came." I took a breath, and then another, and then I went inside because there is a point beyond running where you begin to look like something to chase. June arrived the next afternoon, looking like she'd been trying not to cry for a week, and succeeding only intermittently. She hugged me with the fierce relief of a person who didn't know how to ask for help without bringing her body along as proof. We stood in my kitchen as if standing still could calm a house. "I brought the camera," she said. "Why?" I asked and meant it. "To see if it makes pictures here," she said, and lifted it like a fragile tool. "If it does, we might know which world this place belongs to." I didn't want it to belong to either. We made a plan that sounded like a plan. We'd wait the day out. If anything happened, we'd be together for it. If nothing did, we'd sleep in shifts, one of us in a chair with the kitchen in sight. Morning would be the victory. It always is when you promise yourself only one thing at a time. Late afternoon stretched long and pale. We made soup and didn't eat it. We watched the edges of the room like watchers at a dam. The light went sideways and soft. Somewhere a dog barked twice, not urgently. The ordinary world tried to make a case for itself and almost won. Elijah called as the sky turned the color of unpolished tin. I answered on speaker with June close enough to hear his breath. "I left my apartment," he said. No hello. No shape to the words, but the shape their weight gave them. There was a table in the hallway again. Someone had set it with the plates from my cupboard. I didn't put them back. I left. "Where are you?" June asked. "A motel," he said. "I'm not sleeping. Every time I close my eyes, I'm sitting down. I don't mean to. I just am." "Come here," I said. "Wheel." The line crackled. A sound came through like a knife across a crust. Elijah's breath went silent the way sound does when a microphone cuts off the top of a wave. The call ended without ending. My phone screen showed nothing but my own reflection in the kitchen behind me, warped in glass. We stood without moving for long enough that the light outside faded 3 measurable degrees. The room accepted the change with the indifference of wood. "I want to try something," June said at last, and I heard the part of her voice that had always been good at walking into rooms where someone else's fear had turned the air strange. She took the camera, checked the battery, and raised it slowly so we could both watch through the rear screen. She framed the kitchen table. 3 glasses sat there, each half full. I hadn't seen them appear. I had looked away, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. They weren't cold. They weren't warm. They looked like a fact. The camera didn't care. It showed what was in front of it. Wood glass, water, the dull shine of a blade. "Don't," I said, because the blade lay there now. Not the bread knife. A butter knife. Clean. Familiar. The kind of tool you reach for without thinking when you're talking and not watching your hands. June took the picture. The digital shutter made the small, polite sound it always made. She lowered the camera and looked at the screen. The photo showed the table. It showed the glasses. It showed the knife. It also showed 3 plates where there were none, white and waiting, with napkins folded on them in shapes that weren't any shape I knew. Little mountains. Little tents. She lifted the camera again and pressed the shutter a second time. The second photo matched the first perfectly. The plates were only in the pictures. The pictures were all the way here. "Okay," June said, each letter of the word like a foothold. "Then we know." We didn't know, but we had an edge to hold on to while the rest of the floor creaked. Evening became evening. The line between one and the other was a temperature drop and a shift in the window's reflection. The kitchen light caught our faces in the glass for a moment before the outside took the frame back. I saw us standing there and felt like we had been standing there forever. The scrape of a chair came from behind us. Not the one at the table. The one by the back door. The spare we never used except when too many people came for stew. It moved 3 inches. The sound was small and polite. It made my heartbeat feel too big for my chest. "Don't look," June whispered. I didn't. She didn't. We stood as if we were the ones the house had set down exactly where it wanted and would be offended to find moved. A soft knock on the back door, courteous and patient, like a neighbor who knows you're home. Then the sound of something being placed gently against what outside. Then nothing at all. June and I held still for a count that I couldn't keep straight. The house breathed. The floor decided not to creak. When I looked at her, she nodded. We opened the door together. The porch table held nothing. The boards were dry. My yard lamp made the world look like a photograph of itself. But the smell of cinnamon was strong enough to wear. It felt like stepping into memory. June lifted the camera and shot the empty boards. The preview showed a loaf. It showed steam I couldn't see. It showed 3 plates and a small dish of raspberries like droplets of heart laid out on white. I didn't step forward. I didn't step back. I had the strange sense that if I moved, I would be adjusting the focus for someone else. Behind us, the indoor table clicked. We turned in the same fraction of a second, the way siblings do when a noise is both too small and too close. The butter knife had moved. Not much, just rotated, handle angled now toward the chair nearest the window. And then the window did what glass does when night leans against it. It took our reflections and laid them gently over the room. 2 of us, 2 chairs, 2 glasses, and behind those, faint as what you see after you stare at a light, and then close your eyes, 3 pale ovals where faces would be if anyone stood there. The ovals didn't look at us. They looked down. The urge to shut the door, lock it, and pretend the world was a smaller, safer set of facts almost won. The thing that kept me from doing it wasn't courage. It was the old hunter's instinct my father had taught me without telling me he was teaching. When something makes a ritual in front of you, and that ritual seems to want the piece of you that says yes by habit, you break the habit instead. Outside, I said softly, and we stepped back onto the porch. I pulled the door toward me until it was almost closed and left it there, neither open nor shut, a mouth that hadn't decided whether to speak. Dusk reached its thin hand between the trees and touched the yard. The line where day ends here is fuzzy and drawn out, but there are still moments that count. The porch light hummed with a new pitch. The air shifted the way it does when a front moves through. Something touched the other side of the door. Not a knock. Just wait. Not enough to open it. Enough to test whether we would do the rest. I didn't. The house waited. The yard held. The spruce along the fence didn't move, but the space between their branches felt occupied again. Not thick like a body, present like a decision. The butter knife slid 4 inches across the indoor table with a tiny sigh against wood. June reached for my hand and didn't pretend it was for me. I felt her knuckles like small, precise bones against my skin. We stood so close that if one of us fell, we would both. The thing on the other side of the door put its weight down properly then. Not like a test, like a choice. The door opened the rest of the way, slow and considerate, the latch clicking softly against the plate the way a tongue touches teeth when someone thinks. Air moved past us from inside to outside, and then the other way, a brief, strange reversal, as if the house had taken a breath in and then out. We didn't see it. We saw what it did. The indoor table shifted a hand's width toward the door. The glasses trembled and steadied. The knife turned to face the chair that had been dragged a little closer. The window gave us our reflections without the faint ovals. Whatever had been looking down had decided to move its attention into the room. Back, I whispered. We stepped down into the yard. The porch boards felt like a margin I didn't want to stand on when the book turned a page by itself. Gravel gave under my boots. The night widened a little. We weren't far. We were only making a different kind of line. The kitchen light went out, as if someone had pinched it. The yard lamp threw our shadows long and strange across the grass. From inside, the smallest sound, cloth being unfolded. Then the tiny adjustment of cutlery when a finger touches it to straighten. This was the part where I thought I would run. I didn't. Running would have turned the scene into a chase, and I could feel how much this thing loved patterns. Loved the roles rooms give you. Loved the neat assignment of where bodies belong. I broke the pattern. I walked away from my own door. Across the yard. Past the truck. Past the shed with the ladder that always sticks and the oil stain that has the shape of a bird in flight. toward the spruce where the shadows collect naturally and don't have to be invited. The smell of cinnamon came with us as if attached to our clothes. The door didn't slam. It didn't lock. It eased itself shut with the kind of kindness that sets a plate down without noise. We stood under the trees and watched our house watch us. The yard lamp buzzed once like a thought and then settled. The porch was a stage with no actors visible and too much set dressing. A breeze moved through the topmost branches far above us. Lower down, the air kept its agreement to stay still. Inside, a chair leg tapped and tapped again, adjusting. The scrape of wood told us where to imagine the positions of things if we had dared look. I had the absurd picture of an empty room conducting itself like an orchestra for an audience it had chosen. June leaned close and spoke near my ear, so the words didn't have far to travel. "It wants us to sit." "I know," I said. "We can't," she said. "I know." We waited for it to get bored or angry or impatient. None of those words matched. What came instead felt like a teacher waiting for you to remember a rule you'd been told kindly and more than once. The back door opened again without a hand. I saw the edge of it in the yard light, black line becoming a little wider black. The smell of cinnamon thinned, as if heat had been let out of a room. Something placed something on the threshold. It didn't make a sound. It was present, and then it was there the way a stain slowly appears under a glass on a tablecloth. June lifted the camera almost without thinking, then changed her mind halfway and lowered it. I understood. If the camera showed more than we could see, sometimes less is mercy. "What happens if we don't go in?" she asked. "We find out the version of us that does," I said, "and it learns our names and addresses." We stepped back one more pace until a branch touched the back of my neck and dropped a line of cold down the inside of my collar. I held on to that discomfort like a tether to ordinary pain. It anchored me better than fear. Inside, the kitchen light came on again without a flicker. We didn't look. The door closed. We didn't run. We held until the yard lamp sensor, confused by the stillness we had made, shut itself off with a little click. Darkness settled in closer. The house was now a lit box in a field of night. Our breaths marked time. The spruce became walls. Then, from the darkness behind us, a sound I had not expected. The slow, careful crunch of someone walking on last year's needles. Not toward us. Along the edge, parallel to the fence. The hair on my arms rose with a new kind of knowing. We were not the only ones refusing the roles we'd been given. June's hand tightened on mine. I let go and reached into my pocket without taking my eyes off the lit rectangle of the kitchen window. I pulled out my whistle, bright orange, cheap, hollow, and put to my lips. The blast shattered the yard into sharp edges. The echo bounced off the trees and came back wearing a different jacket. The crunching steps paused. So did the house. We stood in that paused world and felt the option unlatch. We took it. Back to Earl's. Lights. The television. The man's breath that made sense. We told him enough to be rude. We left out enough to be kind. He offered his couch without saying the word afraid, and we accepted without saying the word safe. I slept there like I had when I was 10 and had woken from the kind of dream that turns your own room into a stranger. June took the chair with her knees tucked up and the blanket twisted around her like a rope. Morning didn't wash anything away. It just put a sturdy floor under our feet. We went back together. My kitchen was as we'd left it, except for the threshold. A single slice of bread lay there like a bookmark. No crumbs, no knife marks, no butter, just a perfect cross-section, clean and pale, crust unbroken except where the cut had made it into a map. We didn't step over it. We didn't touch it. We sat on the porch steps and watched the door like people visiting someone in a hospital who can't yet go in. June lifted the slice with 2 fingers and set it on the porch table. The place where it had lain on the threshold showed no stain, no impression. The house had not taken the gesture as an invitation or a refusal. It had taken it as information. I brewed coffee because ritual is a kind of fence. We drank it outside while the day arranged itself. Birds tried the air and accepted it again. A pickup went by, and its engine didn't sound like a voice. The normal world won for a while. At noon, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it buzzed again. Same number. I answered. A woman's voice, professional and kind. "This is the White Horse RCMP. We're looking for a contact for Elijah Morgan. You're listed as his emergency number from a recent lodging form." My mouth dried out. I looked at June. She watched me and knew. "What happened?" I asked. "We found a vehicle left at the side of the Alaska Highway near Fox Lake," she said. "Keys inside. Belongings secure. The motel reports he checked out early. We're not calling it anything yet. If you hear from him, please tell him to call us." I said I would. I put the phone down on the step between us. We didn't talk for a minute that felt like a bad hour. "I think it doesn't like when plans change," June said softly. "He left his apartment. He left the motel. He didn't sit down." I didn't answer. The edges of my vision felt too bright, the way they do when you stand up too fast. I pressed my palms against the wood of the step until the splinters reminded me where my hands were. We decided without explaining it out loud. If the thing wanted a table, it would have to make one without us. We would take ourselves out of rooms, out of houses, out of all the places furniture tells you who you are. We packed like we were leaving for a 2-day hike and then didn't take the trail. We walked into the low country where the willows knit together and the ground makes a sound like listening. We slept the first night under a tarp strung high between two spruce, our bags zipped to our chins, the stars looking like holes punched in a sheet held over a lantern. Night noises belonged to animals again. Morning came with the cold mouth of a river and fog. The second night, we were less careful and more tired. We chose a spot too close to a game trail and dozed between the kind of dreams that smell like bread and the kind that smell like wet wool. At some deep hour, I woke to a soft sound and knew at once what it was because I had learned it too well, the careful adjustment of a chair. My chest went cold before my skin did. I didn't move. June breathed slow and deep beside me, faking sleep or real, I couldn't tell. The tarp creaked with a breeze it shouldn't have noticed. I lifted my head a fraction and looked. Under the tarp, there were no chairs. There were no plates. There was our stove, our packs, our boots, our two human bodies doing the human thing of pretending fear listens to reasons. The sound had come from beyond the edge of our small circle of nylon and cord. On the other side of the tarp line, in the damp dim where the forest keeps its wet secrets, stood a table. It wasn't wood from a store. It wasn't handmade. It was the idea of a table expressed in what the forest had at hand. For legs made of stripped willow, a top that looked like the slice of a large spruce trunk, too fresh to be cut, sap beating at the gummy edges. On it, 3 flat stones the size and color of plates. Beside them, a river-worn stick. Not a knife. Close enough. I did not sit up. I did not speak. I looked at June and found her eyes open, wide, reflecting the small light our headlamps made on low settings. We watched the table stand there as if it had grown out of the ground in that shape, which in a way it had. The forest around us held its breath for the space of 5, maybe 6 heartbeats. Then the table shifted a fraction, not down, not up, but forward as if to say it could cross lines we thought weren't lines. We left the tarp where it was and crawled backward out of the other side. A ridiculous move that might have looked comic if anyone had been there to see. We stood and stepped into the deeper dark without speaking, our bodies making room for each other automatically, the way people who grew up together do when they have to pass in a small kitchen. We walked until our legs shook. We walked until my head felt clear because fear had burned all the fog away. We stopped only when the trees thinned and the sky widened and the stars had shifted places twice. We set no tarp. We kept no circle. We stood, sat on our packs, and waited for morning to pick us up by the scruff. It did. Morning is reliable that way. It came with bird startles and the clatter of a squirrel who had not been briefed on our situation. We laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because the world had stayed. "I don't think it will stop," June said, and because we were tired and honest, I said, "Me neither." She looked down at her hands and back up at me. "Then we go back. To the valley?" I asked, though I knew. Some things need to be said into the air to give them edges to hold. "Yes," she said. "It started there, or it learned us there. Either way, it knows the shape of that room best. If there's a way to make it choose the room without us in it, we'll find it there." It wasn't a good plan. It was a plan that fit the shape of the problem we had, which is different and sometimes all you get. We turned our faces toward old country. The miles laid themselves out like a story you already knew the ending to and had decided to read again anyway. We didn't talk much. Talking had begun to feel like pulling on threads in a sweater I liked. The weather held, polite and gray. The creek we knew sounded like it had always sounded. Even mosquitoes felt almost kind, their attention simple and without ambition. At the lip of the moraine, we paused where we had paused before. The valley lay open like an empty hand. The grass shone. The light made small, honest changes in color and shadow. There was no cabin. I didn't expect to see one. I expected to feel the absence we had felt last time, the purposeful gap where a thing isn't the way a missing tooth changes the tongue's map. Instead, the valley felt full. Not of sound, of attention. We descended. The air near the bottom had the temperature of rooms where food has been recently cooked. The breeze, such as it was, carried spice so faint that I could have convinced myself it was memory if the hair on my arms hadn't lifted again. We walked to the exact spot we remembered because the moss was different there, flattened in a way that had not quite forgiven us for being the first time. We stopped in that flat. Nothing changed except my own pulse. June took the camera out and held it with both hands. She didn't raise it. She just kept it ready, like a talisman that worked by being there. I stood beside her and tried not to set my boots into a pattern that could be read. We waited. The sun went behind a passing cloud and came out again a degree to the west. Insects made their private errands. I felt foolish for a long enough stretch to wonder if foolishness was the point. Then, half a step to our left, the ground pressed down as if a heavy bowl had been set there carefully. The moss flattened slightly. The line of dew broke and reformed around a new rim. A matching circle appeared beside it a second later, then a third. Water gathered at the tops of 3 invisible glasses and began to trail down along sides that weren't there. I didn't move. The air in front of us thickened a fraction and then smoothed. A smell rose, not cinnamon now. Something older. Flour. Smoke. Stone. The table arrived without arriving, the way a story becomes true by being repeated in the same place by the right voice. The sense of surface organized itself in front of us. Light reflected off edges our eyes told us weren't there. A knife we couldn't see laid itself down with a soft, purposeful tap. June lifted the camera. She didn't have to look at the screen. We both knew what it would show. Ask it, she said. What? Ask it what it wants, she said, and her voice trembled not from fear, but from the kind of anger that makes you careful. It keeps making the scene. It keeps asking us to play our parts. If we won't, it will keep playing with us. I swallowed against a dryness that felt like dust. What do you want? I asked the air that had arranged itself into furniture. The answer didn't come as a word. It came as a shift. The knife rolled so that the handle pointed at me. June spoke then to whatever sat in the space where a host would sit. No. The knife rolled back to neutral, then turned toward her. No, she said again, firmer. The knife paused. The air reorganized a tiny degree. One of the invisible glasses moved in a patient circle, the kind of motion a person makes when they're considering what to say next. Offer it something else, June whispered without turning her head. Trade, not our places. I looked around as if the trees might suggest a bargain. My mind offered the dumb inventory of a person whose life is small and loved. Pack, jacket, camera, boots, names. I crouched slowly, set my palm to the flat place where the cabin had stood in a different version of the world, and spoke the only thing I had that felt exact enough to be taken. I'll tell you a story, I said, every day until you forget the shape of this table. I'll tell it here. I won't bring a chair. I won't bring a plate. I will come before the light gets thin, and I will leave while the shadows are still short. You can have the shape of my voice in the place where you want my hands. That's the trade. The air in front of us didn't change temperature, but my skin understood it differently. The way you understand a half smile isn't a smile and still means something. The knife turned until it pointed nowhere. The glass that had made a small circle settled. The smell of flour faded by a degree small enough to be counted. June let out a breath I hadn't known she'd been holding. She set the camera down with care on the moss. We stood there long enough that our legs started to feel the argument between attention and endurance. Then, Together, we stepped backward until the hill began, and then we turned because turning is different when it's not a retreat, and we needed different things. At the top of the moraine, I looked back one last time and saw nothing at all, which was what I had asked for. The valley held only itself. We walked home by a route that put us along the river for a long stretch. The water made the sounds it makes when time is behaving. My body slowly convinced itself to stop expecting a chair to be behind every tree. June stayed a week. We didn't talk about Elijah, except at the edges. She left me the camera and said I could keep it a while, like a friend leaving you a dog to get you outside. After she flew back, I started going to the valley in late mornings when light has enough length not to make you think about the parts of day that get thin. I stood where the floor had been and told the air little stories that were true. The time my father fell through river ice and laughed after, and then cried when he was warm. The time my boots sole peeled off and sleet 20 miles from anything, and a woman I didn't know fixed it with wire and a look that suggested she fixed a lot of things that way. The way snow looks blue when the sky is hard white. When I ran out of my own stories, I told other people's, the ones I could carry without stealing. I kept my promises to myself about when I arrived and when I left. Nothing answered. That was the answer. At my cabin, the kitchen table started keeping to its place. The butter knife stayed in the drawer. Sometimes at night, I still heard the small, careful clink of glass against wood from the direction of my back door. It sounded like someone setting the scene somewhere else. A month later, a package came with no return address, just my name written in neat block letters. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and twine, was a book with its cover peeled at the corners and the spine broken into white ladders. I had never owned a copy. I opened it in the doorway with the kind of caution you give to things that have already hurt you and might not be done. The first line read, "We were hiking in the Yukon. We found a cabin with fresh food on the table." I closed it gently and put it on the top shelf where I keep things I'm not ready to throw away and not ready to keep. I haven't seen Elijah. I don't expect to. June texts me sometimes at odd hours to say she can't sleep, and I tell her the weather where I am until the weather where she sounds familiar again. The RCMP called twice more. I told them the little I could without sounding like the kind of person who would chase them in circles. When people ask me now about rules, I tell them ordinary ones. Always carry more water than you think you'll need. Don't snap branches for your fire when deadfall will do. Don't follow a caribou trail in fog. I don't tell them the other thing unless they ask for a story. And if they do, I tell it sometime mid-morning on a day with a clear sky that has the good sense to keep its promises for a few hours. I end the story before the light goes cruel. I go home to my small table and eat standing up, looking out the window at the porch as if it were a stage where a play might start again without me. If you walk far enough out there, past the places maps admit to, you might find a room waiting where a room shouldn't be. If you do, don't sit. Don't touch. Don't stay once the shadows decide the floor looks better with a shape on it. I won't repeat that advice more than once. I don't have to, because if you hear a knife turn on wood and feel the breath of a room trying on your name, you'll know what to do. You'll stand up without standing. You'll step back without moving. You'll give the story of yourself to the space that asked for your seat and walk away while it's busy listening. And if one night, when you've done everything right, you come home and find a single slice of bread laid carefully at your threshold like a letter, step around it. Leave it for the porch light. Let the moths have it. Let the small creatures carry it off crumb by crumb until the shape of it belongs to no one. Then sleep if you can, and if you can't, come find me. I'll be in the valley, late morning, when the ground remembers only the weight of names and not the furniture that tried to learn them. I'll tell you a story, and you can tell me one back. We'll stand on the floor of a room that isn't there and talk until the day is tall enough to make the shadows behave.